A very warm welcome here at COP27, the site event from brown to fair, how regions with heavy industry can manage a just climate transition. Organized here, convened by DG Regio. My name is Carsten Rothballer. I'm coordinator at ICLA Europe, a network of local governments striving for sustainability, and I'm also part of the Secretariat for Core Regions in Transition. And it will be my very pleasure here to guide you to a very interesting panel, an interactive panel where you can also participate, putting questions into the chat and kicking it off. Let me introduce the framework of our very distinguished panel and session of today. The European Union's climate strategy is underpinned by the European Green Deal, which aims at a climate-neutral continent by 2050. All EU policy instruments are mobilized to reach this goal, and this is matched by significant investments into innovation and deployment to ensure that the transition takes place across Europe. One of the key principles of European Green Deal is to leave no one and no region behind. And this is why the EU set up a just transition mechanism, so-called, which mobilized 55 billion euros over the next few years, and already has, to ensure the climate transition that it's happening in a fair manner, and that those regions that are most effective benefit from it. And this transition is, of course, put in the context of climate neutrality within the EU, but we are also looking very much into what we can learn from other regions beyond Europe. And this is the purpose of this session, looking also beyond Europe and drawing lessons from what is happening outside the EU. Let me now introduce our distinguished panel. First of all, Miriam Boveda. She's leading the team in charge of the sustainable growth in the General Directorate for Regional and Urban Policy in the European Commission. Her team is responsible for the coordination of negotiation and implementation of the European Regional Development Fund programs in the fields of the European Green Deal, including the just transition across EU member states and regions. Furthermore, in the studio, we have Andres Fuentes. He is head of the Regional Outlook and Environment Economics Unit of the Economic Analysis, Statistics and Data Division of the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities at the OECD. He leads work to integrate climate policy challenges to regional development. Also with us, Lorenzo Manca, born and raised in Sardinia, which hosts the last coal mine in Italy. His background is climate policy and started to advocating that on EU level, strengthening the representation of youth, in particular, in the just transition. And online with us, Seong Jung. He's co-founder of and director of Plan 1.5, a climate civil society organization advocating for stronger and better climate policies based in South Korea. So with that setting, I'm now happy to hand over to Andres Fuentes, who is bringing to us a very interesting study from the OECD, Regional Industrial Transitions to Climate Neutrality. Andres, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carsten, and thank you very much also to DG Regio and the European Commission for this opportunity to briefly present our work on regional industrial transitions to climate neutrality. The motivation of this work is really quite simple. Some of the economic activities that are most difficult to decarbonize are in manufacturing, and sectoral manufacturing activities are typically regionally concentrated. Socioeconomic characteristics differ across regions, and so therefore a regional perspective is important to get the transition to climate neutrality done and to achieve it with a just transition. Our work has 4 objectives, and I will try to give a glimpse of the insights that we have developed for each. So we started off identifying sectors that face particularly large transformation challenges and to describe the transformations they will require to undertake. And the biggest challenges are concentrated in a few sectors. Some of these industries will require new energy carriers, new material inputs, raw materials, and this will require new infrastructure to get them to the industrial plants. And so therefore we also have a look at the conditions for infrastructure access across regions which host these activities. So this includes access to hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and zero carbon freight. And regions do indeed differ in the access that they will have to these infrastructures. And then thirdly, we identify the regions that are most vulnerable to the transformations that need to be undertaken in these key sectors facing the biggest challenges. And we do so using employment data and emissions data from the European Emissions Trading System. And then fourthly, we identify the socio-economic characteristics of the regions that are most affected by these transitions. These are characteristics of the regions themselves, their workers, and the businesses. And we find that these characteristics often heighten their vulnerability and therefore require policy attention to achieve a just transition. So let me say a few words about the sectors. We have chosen 6 sectors facing particularly important transformations. There's a large literature to describe these transformations that we summarize. I just mention a few high-level characteristics that have spatial implications, implications for the regions in which these activities are happening. So in the production of refined oil products and coke, the issue that stands out that this industry is likely to face the biggest relative employment loss. And that is simply because in our future climate neutral economies, we will need to do without petroleum and without coke. In the production of cement, the production of cement will be most dependent on carbon capture and storage. And this is because technologies to eliminate process emissions in the production of cement are least developed. Chemicals and steel production can do without carbon capture and storage. It may be prudent not to over-rely on carbon capture and storage. But this then reinforces the need to transform production processes fundamentally and increases the demand for hydrogen in both sectors, and especially in chemicals. In paper and pulp production, as in other industries, the challenges are numerous, but the biggest one is perhaps that there will be increasing competition for biomass. And biomass is a key input for paper and pulp production today. So there may be a further shift towards the use of secondary materials in the production of paper and pulp, with implications for production locations. The automobile sector that we've also had to look at is different in that the challenge is not so much about emission reductions, but it is about producing electric vehicles, which are simpler and therefore require less employment to build, especially for the manufacturing of motors and motor parts. And besides, we will need to move to lighter vehicles and to less vehicle use, especially in urban contexts. Moving on to infrastructure access. For infrastructure access, it matters how production facilities are distributed across the European continent. And here you can appreciate on this map what it looks like. And you can see that the production of petrochemicals, so chemicals produced on the basis of fossil fuels, is highly clustered, especially in the northwest of Europe, in northwest Germany, Belgium, southern Netherlands. And by contrast, in the production of cement, it is highly dispersed across the continent. And for the production of primary steel, it's kind of intermediate. Now, the extent of clustering matters for access to zero-emission consistent infrastructure. Because both hydrogen, that we will need for steel and chemicals production, as well as captured CO2 emissions, which will be important, most likely, to be important for the production of cement, are best transported via pipelines. Pipeline infrastructure will be important, but pipelines are subject to scale economies. And that means that clustered production sites will be able to share costs and will therefore face lower unit costs than dispersed production sites. One concern here could be that this could be a driving force for increased economic divergence across regions, because clustered production sites, like in the northwest of Europe for chemicals, are often more economically developed. Then, of course, other types of infrastructure and other location factors play a role, not only pipelines. Local renewable production potentials are also important for the production of hydrogen, though much of it will need to be imported. Connections to ports will be important for freight. The availability of rail infrastructure, which is unequally distributed across the European continent, and the closeness of suitable carbon capture and storage sites. In some regions, the distances to viable carbon capture and storage sites may be long. So how have we gone about identifying the regions that face these important transformation challenges? Well, we've done it for each sector separately, and this illustrates it for chemicals. So we've had a look at the employment shares in the chemicals industry, as well as simultaneously at emissions per capita. And we argue that in those regions where emissions per capita are highest and employment share substantial, that's where the biggest transformation challenges are. And you can see this in the darkest color, very dark purple, almost black, with some regions in Germany, in Hungary, for example, but also in Belgium and the south of the Netherlands. And then you have some regions in blue, like the region where I work, in Ile-de-France, in the Paris region, where employment shares are substantial in the production of chemicals, but emissions are not. And this is likely to come from headquarter effects. And chemicals and industry workers who work at headquarters will face less challenges than workers on the actual production sites. Now moving on to the socioeconomic vulnerability of regions, their capacity to deal with the important transformation challenges. Well, we find that most of them are economically weaker on account of several indicators than their country on average. They tend to be relatively weak in terms of GDP per capita, as well as in terms of wages. They tend to do relatively well on the unemployment rate, and that probably reflects that they have a strong industrial base. And we also find that the jobs in these industrial sectors that face the biggest challenges are often much better paid jobs than other jobs in these regional economies.
Anders, please conclude.
Yes, and this is here my final exhibit. So we also have a look at worker characteristics, and we find that regions differ a lot in terms of the individual vulnerability of workers. So, for example, in the sector of non-metallic minerals production, which includes the production of cement, we've had, for example, had a look at the share of workers earning below the national median. And this share is large in the region of Centro Italia, exceeding 70%, whereas in the Région Wallonne, which is also an important non-metallic minerals producing region, this share is only 30%. So we also need to look at each region individually to find out how vulnerable workers may be to these transitions. This concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Anders, for this outline. Very interesting. I took away challenges, concentrate in a few sectors here to analyze in particular, and that maybe clustered arrangement of industry do provide better leeway. But if scattered through and weakened, then maybe also here circular economy can play an important way forward in how to reorganize the infrastructure. Having said that, I would now very much like to continue with the panel. First of all, with statements and with some food for further thought. And here, my first question to Miriam on how European regions with heavy industry can manage the climate transition, the just climate transition well. Miriam, over to you.
Thank you, Carsten. On our side, we know, and Andres has shown also with the study, that the socio-economic impacts of the transition to climate neutrality are unevenly spread across the EU regions and territories, which are highly dependent from carbon-intensive industries, such as steel, cement, or chemicals, or from solid fossil fuels, such as coal, peat, and oil shale. We have a policy in DG Regio, the cohesion policy, which has accompanied these transitions for decades. And we know what can happen to regions when these transitions take place. And we need to draw the lessons from the past. And we need to give different responses. And we know, first of all, that the sooner we prepare, the better we can manage the impact on people and places. So we need to core regions to take full advantage of a newly created fund that we have put in place, which is the Just Transition Fund and the Just Transition Mechanism, which you mentioned in the introduction. And this fund allows for a place-based approach. And this approach is to be in line with the local needs and local strength of the regions. Because we believe that regions know best which investments are needed for creating jobs, retraining workers, and revitalizing abandoned sites. With these funds, the European Commission aims at accompanying the affected regions in their path towards climate neutrality and help them finding a new future for their citizens and to mitigate any potential impact of the transition which is negative for them. So I would like to focus on the three aspects which are novel in the Just Transition Fund and in the Just Transition Mechanism, and which are key in our sense for the regions to respond to these challenges. First of all, and this is not only for fossil fuels dependent regions, the GTF will help those territories which are mostly heavily impacted by the transition, and notably because of job losses. As Andres underlined, this is a huge challenge in terms of job losses and needs for reskilling. We have now around 100 territories that will be supported by this fund. And I can tell you also that around 60 are linked to coal, peat, or oil shale. the others will also be supported because of the transformation of carbon-intensive industries such as steel, chemicals or cement. The second aspect, which is key, is that we need to focus on the impacts of the transitions. The GTF investment will be mostly about reskilling people, creating jobs in new sectors, and regenerating affecting areas. They will come on top of investments for the European Regional Development Fund and the Cohesion Fund, which are the primarily source for investments in energy efficiency, renewable energy, mobility, circular economy, biodiversity, or other priorities which are also key for the transition. This is also integrated in a territorial approach, which is the third key element that we are putting in place within a principle which is central to cohesion policy and is of utmost importance for the Just Transition Fund, which is the partnership principle. It's about the governance of the transition. And according to this principle, all regional, national and local stakeholders should be involved and should take ownership of the transition in their territory. The regional and local level should be part of the debate about the future of their territories while designing territorial just transition plans and just transition fund programs. It starts, moreover, from the vision of the territories on how their climate neutral future can be a success at the appropriate level. So we have a specific framework for these measures, which are the territorial just transition plans. These are documents that the GTF territories need to submit to the European Commission for their negotiation and adoption and funding from the Commission. And I can already tell you that the programming of this fund is already ongoing, and we had already several territorial just transition plans adopted. So at this point of time, we have 22 TGTPs adopted in 9 member states, which represent more than 30% of the budget allocated. And already Estonia has approved the first Just Transition Fund project. This is in Ida-Viru, a region that will be hit by the phase out of oil shale, where the GTF will contribute to building a new magnet factory. Not only will it bring much needed jobs, it will also make sure that this region will be a front runner in the manufacturing of the so-called strategic material that we need for the transition to climate neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, here outlining and strengthening the approach that here the Commission is bringing forward, a place-based approach, as well as a partnership principle here applied most of all, looking at different governmental levels, but also bringing together different stakeholders. And here I would like to turn now to Lorenzo and ask you the question of how can actually, from the perspective of youth, what can youth bring to the table when it comes to national ambitions, national plans, targets of climate neutrality? What is the role of youth here in this picture? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. And yes, I'm very happy that Mrs. Boveda just mentioned the partnership principle and how it lies at the core of the Just Transition mechanism and in general of the cohesion policy of the European Union. And because my work at the Youth Climate Coalition, Generation Climate Europe, is to monitor specifically how young people have been engaged in the Just Transition, but this work is also carried out in general for the implementation of the whole partnership principle by several other NGOs like WWF, like Bankwatch, that they do an amazing job every day to monitor not just how civil society in general is being involved in the decisions that are taken for the just transition mechanism. And well, when it comes to youth in particular, of course, it's a key stakeholder for the decisions for the just transition mechanism, because the just transition mechanism is an extremely ambitious instrument that its final aim is to reshape the economy of the regions that depend on fossil fuels or heavy industry to make them find a place in the green economy and to avoid creating unemployment and poverty with the green transition. And of course, in this context, of course, all the actors of the local community are fundamental to make sure that they take ownership of the projects that will be approved and of the decisions that are being made, because of course it's about the future of their community. But in this context, youth specifically, well, they represent the next generation that is supposed to live in those communities, and they're supposed to benefit from the decisions that are made now with the just transition mechanism. And so, of course, our main battle is to make sure that young people always sit at the table when the consultations are made on how to spend the money for the just transition mechanism, what projects to fund, and what new sectors to create after fossil fuels and after or to decarbonize heavy industry. And yeah, well, the first step that we took was to have a look at how young people have been engaged so far. And we did it this year through a report with 2 editions in which we scouted how this was done in 15 EU countries. And well, luckily our main conclusion was that we could find youth engagement activities all across the EU, and alongside the general activities that are done to include the civil society, businesses, trade unions in the decisions on how to spend the just transition mechanism. Of course, the quality of this engagement of young people varies a lot from region to region. There are best cases and bad cases a little bit all around the EU. There is not a particular good cases in some countries or in some areas of the European Union in particular. But in general, what I could see from these examples of young people sitting at the table and giving their contribution to the decision on how to spend the funding from the just transition mechanism is that, yeah, well, we can bring a huge contribution on rethinking not just specifically the economy and what kind of sectors we want, but also what lies before. Because of course, well, young people are already in the education system and they can see its benefits and its flaws, and also how it can contribute to make sure that people have the right skills and have the right expertise to actually play a role in the green economy. Because of course, if you are deciding to shift to a new economic sector and to create new economic sectors in your region, of course you will need specific skills that at the moment are not present in the region. And so, and also the fact that these regions often suffer from higher youth unemployment and brain drain than other regions in their own countries, well, also shows that yeah, it's fundamental to engage young people to make sure that they can also bring new ideas on how to prevent that, how to make sure that that the new generations in their own region do not just leave it to study in another part of the country or abroad and then remaining outside their region. So that's, yeah, in general, young people as the representative on the next generation, because of course next generation EU and the Green Deal is already about this generation of young people that will be adults in the coming years in the new green economy that is being created. And of course, their main role now is to be represented, and so that their needs and also their proposals for what needs to change at the systemic level in their own region must happen, so that actually the just transition can achieve its goals and actually making sure that these regions play an active role in the transition to the green economy.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. That must be music to the ears of Miriam, that the Just Transition mechanism is seen as an ambitious instrument. It's actually also the newest instrument, as we have learned. And here that the recommendation that ownership can substantially be increased of decision-making when youth is here also part of the decision-making process. Last but not least, and we have promised to also broaden the picture outside of Europe, we have here Sejong with us with a short presentation from South Korea. Sejong.
Thank you, Carsten. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share our thoughts from Korea. Next slide, please. Just transition is a very important question for the Korean economy because a sizable portion of the nation's economy is based on carbon-intensive industry, and that is particularly apparent in two regions. Chungnam is hosting half of the nation's coal power plants, 29 units, and Gyeongnam province is home of the major heavy industry, traditional heavy industry, including automobile manufacturing, shipbuilding, steelmaking, and also petrochemical industry. And these represent a very sizable portion of the economy and also a lot of jobs. Next slide, please. Starting with the coal power industry in Chungnam, we have found 23,000 employees are working in these coal power plants. And the regional government, the local government has been trying to introduce and transition this industry into renewables and to renewable related jobs, and also come up with new industries that could host the working power. But despite these efforts, the actual change we see on the field is quite minimal. It's quite a nascent stage. Next slide, please. On the automobile industry, interestingly, a recent study by Greenpeace found that most of the workers in the automobile industry in the Gyeongnam region, they agree with the transition. They recognize the need to transition because climate change is a serious threat, and they even support ban on internal combustion engines. But they're also very aware and quite concerned that this transition could result in loss of jobs because EV transition does not necessarily guarantee the same number of jobs as the internal combustion engine-based vehicles. Next slide, please. Also on the shipbuilding industry, the main problem with the shipbuilding industry is most of the products in the shipbuilding industry is fossil fuel related. Korean shipbuilders are building most of the LNG carriers around the world. They're dominating the market, which could be good news for the moment, but at the same time, if we look further into the future, it's quite uncertain how longer this type of demand could continue. They are trying to build offshore wind platforms and new type of vessels as the next step. But with the backlog of orders on these fossil fuel related vessels, the change is quite slow. And because of the current market situation, the question of just transition and the need for transition, I think it's still in a very early stage. Next slide, please. Looking at the legal framework, the Carbon Neutrality Act, which lays out the legal basis and the policy measures for climate mitigation and just transition are there. We have various policy measures in the law and also in the regulations that promise these procedures and approaches for just transition. But in actuality, we haven't really seen meaningful projects in terms of just transition, and very small fraction of climate change related budget has been allocated to just transition related efforts. Next slide, please. So why is this happening? What's the challenge? We observed 2 points. First, this lack of policy support. Without a clear sign by the central government as an overseeing policy directive, we believe just transition questions can be difficult to be ignited because there's no a coal phase-out year set by the government. So the current plan is to operate coal power plants beyond 2040, which leaves the question of just transition in kind of a more long-term based context. And also, there's no internal combustion engine ban on the automobile industries. So without these clear message or signal from the government, it's always more difficult to emphasize the need for this transition. And it's not just about the domestic initiative. We also saw a growing LNG demand and continuing demand for LNG vessels is driving the shipbuilding industry deeper into carbon-intensive assets and products. And also a recent development in the United States, for example, Inflation Reduction Act prioritizes decarbonization of its own economy. And as a result, we have seen Korean companies, automobile companies, battery builders, many the next step industries prioritizing their investment in different markets because they need to adjust to these new regulations. And we believe this could create a balloon effect where carbon intensive industries could remain outside these jurisdictions. I'll finish up on here and thank you.
Thank you so much, Seong, for your insights here from Korea. That sounds very interesting, and also it relates very much to observations that we have, can note in Europe here, for instance, that industry, even in coal power plants, workers do recognize the need to change, to decarbonize. Climate change is real also for them, and therefore they also wish to find different perspective in terms of job, but also for different perspectives of skills and employment. That brings us then again very much to the center of this debate of today, looking at governmental aspects, in particular to mitigate these worries, and also to steer and give new perspectives. And here maybe how to govern the just transition. The first question here to Miriam again, what governmental aspects do you see are crucial to ensure that the transition is happening in a fair way, and that regions that are most affected by it can actually benefit from it?
Thanks, Carsten. At our level, and we see that these elements are also required in the Just Transition Fund regulation and required in the territorial Just Transition plans. So I would see 4 key elements. The first one is that there should be a clear commitment for transition. And where we have solid fossil fuels, there should be a clear commitment for exiting solid fossil fuels. This is a prerequisite. No transition, no funding, because we don't see the aim of it. So there should be a clear transition pathway also. How are we going to reach this goal with the transition key steps? So this is the second element. And of course, we need to know, and this is also why we are working with the OECD, assess clearly the socio-economic impacts of this transition. It's very important that we see that there are negative impacts, because there are certain regions where the transition is going to take place, but there might be no clear socio-economic negative impacts. And once we have identified these negative impacts, the government should clearly identify the measures to be supported to counteract these negative impacts. And the fourth element, which is key, which I mentioned before, but I think we never mentioned it sufficiently, is that the governance system to be put in place by the governments should be very inclusive, so that everybody in the appropriate territory should take ownership of the transition and of its objectives, and see a clear positive aspect of being engaged in the transition for having a positive development program for the territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. And here, maybe looking at Lorenzo, can you complement here from what Miriam just mentioned from the perspective of youth again?
Well, I think that little can be added to these, well, to the remarks of the Commission, because yeah, the just transition mechanism at the moment is being kicked off. So what we know is what will happen so far in the making of the plans for the just transition. But we still cannot judge what's going to happen because of course the process is still ongoing and it's still at the very first phases in terms of implementation. Well, what I can say in terms of governance is that well, a fundamental element is to keep the civil society engaged, including of course young people. Well, in the case of young people, there have been cases across the EU where most of the civil society, businesses and trade unions were engaged in the decisions on how to spend the just transition mechanism, but youth was not specifically engaged. So from that point of view, this is a gap that can still be filled, so that the situation can be harmonized all across the EU, and we can make sure that in all regions, the whole civil society, including next generations, are included not just in the decisions, but also in the monitoring of how the decisions are being implemented. It's fundamental that there is a clear follow-up, and that all the groups in the civil society that have been engaged so far remain engaged in the future. This is already happening. There are already monitoring committees being set up in different member states. So what's needed now is just to make sure that these monitoring committees remain inclusive and remain open also to inputs from all areas of the civil society, so that also the least represented groups in each region can make their voice heard and make sure to be included in the just transition. And maybe another thing that I wanted to highlight is some further remarks that come from the European Court of Auditors, which last week published a report on how EU funding has supported the core regions in particular so far. And unfortunately, what they found in the report is that in the period 2014-2020, when the just transition mechanism was not yet there, the other EU funds have not been able to create enough jobs and to create a strong enough push for sustainability in those regions. So, and what the European Court of Auditors suggests is to make sure that this time for the just transition mechanism there are clear targets, and there are clear governance mechanisms, and that of course the plans remain remaining on track with the deadlines, and do not require too much or do not plan over much compared to very strict deadlines that are there for spending this money. And so yeah, I would like. Yes. So yeah, my two main suggestions are to keep the civil society engaged also in the implementation phase, and to keep track and to implement also the remarks of the European Court of Auditors, so that we make sure that the just transition mechanism is different from the funds that have been preceded it.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for reminding us this is a process, and it of course doesn't stop. It's a continuation, and in particular of engagement, of follow-up, of trust, extending relationships. Andres, you analyzed very much different sectors with different needs and perspectives. What recommendations can you bring to the table of what supporting structures did you identify as crucial for govern the transition in a just manner?
Carsten, I would really like to get back to the question of youth and the importance of young people in this transition process, and because they will need to build their careers in the future climate neutral world, and so it's very important to give them a voice. And so I very much appreciate Lorenzo's remarks. We have also, for this reason, had a look at young people in our work, and we find that the labor market position is often not as favorable as it should be, to facilitate access to training and to give them the career prospects that they require in view of these transformations. So, for example, we've had a look at the share of temporary employment contracts of young workers, and in some of these sectors, in some of the regions, I'm looking here at the numbers, for instance, for the Centralny region in Poland, the share of workers below the age of 30 on a temporary contract exceeds 60%. And that exposes them not only to a bigger risk of job loss, but it also means that they are less likely to be trained, because employers have incentives to train workers on permanent contracts, but not workers on temporary contracts. So here too, there are things to be done to improve young people's labour market prospects in the transition. On the governance arrangements, I very much agree with Miriam that it's very important to have multi-level governance. An institutionalized dialogue between the central or national government and the regions and the local governments. That's very important. And I think it's also important to use the financing flows across levels of government. So, for example, the transfers that flow from central government to the regions or between the regions, to harness them for the transition. In fact, all policy levels need to be harnessed for to the benefit of climate policy. And multi-level governance, multi-level finance flows should be no exception. And this is important because some regions will do better in the transition than others. And there is a risk that territorial divergence may increase if there's no policy action. And so finance flows across levels of government can lean against such risks of territorial divergence. And such financing flows, transfers, can also be linked to objectives. So that a region in the central government, for instance, can agree on an objective, perhaps on the expansion of renewable electricity production, or perhaps on the renovation of social housing. And these funding flows can also be linked to reaching objectives that need to be met in the transition to climate neutrality.
Thank you. Key performance indicators also in the setting of different governmental levels, I think, are very important, because science is telling us in Sharm-el-Sheikh and continuously throughout the year of where we are, and that we need to walk and actually run faster. Sejong, you have also taken the perspective with various industries here. Your recipe, your recommendations here for structural changes to happen, how to guide them on a governmental level.
Yeah, I very much resonate with points raised by Miriam and Andres. I again want to emphasize the importance of having a clear goal from the central government, because we've seen cases where concerns around just transition and job losses were used to justify postponing mitigation efforts and transition efforts, because it's an actual concern. But to change that question of whether we should or when should we transition into, we need to do it now, but how? I think a clear sign from the central government, a clear target is required, and to persuade that to the region and the affected community, the central government should really commit a firm financing and funding and support, and that's how they back and evidence their real intent. And I think that's the most important step.
Okay, thank you very much. Talking about steps, we are close to also the final statement of Miriam, but before that, maybe a quick tour de table of a message that you would like to emphasize from your perspective of your stakeholders that you have engaged with or you represent on moving forward the role of cities, of regions, of of youth. What is one point that you would very much like to emphasize, because within the discussion it is often overlooked or unheard? Maybe first turning to Lorenzo.
Yes. Well, I think that, well, from the point of view of governments, from the EU, the national governments and the local governments in Europe, it is important that this multi-level governance remains in place, and it remains open, it remains inclusive, and it really mobilizes the local communities as well as the national level and the European level to make sure that there is a strong connection, and that everybody feels ownership of the just transition, feels its need, and feels that this time phasing out some sectors of the economy is not coming with the unemployment and poverty, but is coming with new opportunities. And yeah, I do hope that this can also be taken up also in other countries, in the global community, because yes, as we see in South Korea, for instance, there is not yet a clear framework at the national level for the just transition, whereas in the Paris Agreement, the just transition is mentioned as a fundamental tool to cope with the green transition in general. And in Europe already, before the just transition mechanism of the EU was launched, some countries like Ireland and Spain were already activating themselves to launch their national just transition programs. So probably a lesson that could be taken for the global community is for each country in their own capacity and with their own needs to try to launch their own just transition programs, so that they take strongly into account what are the consequences of phasing out fossil fuels, and how the people who are currently working in those industries can find a new opportunity in the green economy. This is important both in the global north, in OECD countries, and in the global south. So I think each country should think about it in their own capacity.
Thank you. Maybe then, Sejong, you are next, as you have been also addressed.
Yeah. I want to make a note on the role of the regional governments, local governments, because if just transition is a vehicle, I really think the local community should take the steering wheel, and the central government, the governmental structure, should be fueling them, because it's really regional. What they need, what they can do, what kind of jobs they can actually take, what are the industry potentials of that specific community. It's a very localized and it's very specific information that can be better reached by regional governments and leaders of the community. So building kind of on grassroots basis with the NGOs, civil society, and bringing it up, I think it's a really big, important step.
Thank you. And then turning to Andres, from your perspective here, a very important step to move forward, or a very argument that you would like to stress?
Well, I think it is really important to work with each of the most affected regions in terms of industrial transitions, to work with each region individually. Because we have seen in our research that the heterogeneity is very big across all 4 dimensions that we've worked on. The industrial structure is different. The infrastructure access conditions and infrastructure access needs in the context of moving to net zero emissions are different across regions. And then also the socioeconomic conditions are very different. And both in terms of worker characteristics and in terms of firm characteristics, how productive are they? That's also something we've had a look at in our report. There's a lot of heterogeneity. And so it is important to work with each of the vulnerable regions individually and develop a precise analysis and an action plan on this basis.
Thank you so much for these 3 perspectives. And now turning to Miriam, you are able to deliver in a broader sense towards the question, but also going beyond. So handing over to you for your statement. Thank you.
As a conclusion and as a closing statement, I would like to say that, I would like to thank also the four participants who are with us today from different horizons, but I think from South Korea to the EU, we have the same approach, which is reassuring. So it means that maybe we can have common solutions to this major issue that we are seeing, which needs to be implemented to reach climate neutrality and to reach the objectives that are set in terms of climate ambition. So we saw that we need to have a very clear socio-economic analysis of the impacts that will take place. And Andres has shown that extensive work is already ongoing and will need still to be done also at more local and regional level with the dialogue also, and dialogue is key also for the regions and the local authorities. Then Lorenzo has told us, and we know it's partnership is very important, but youth are key in this transition process. And there are two aspects to why they are keys, because they will be hit by the transition and by climate change. They are the coming generation, and we need to have them fully on board. Also because the regions which are mostly affected suffer also for high brain drain and impacts which are hitting them. So also youth will bring innovative and creative solutions. So it's very important to have them, and we see that they are taken on board for the future of their territories in a very different way across European regions. And we need to call all regions to include them fully in the process. And then Si-young from for Korea shows us that they have identified problematic sectors for the transition, and they are very much concentrated. And although there is a regulation in place, there needs to be also a policy will, and that shows the direction. And a clear signal from the governments are key also for the transition to be a success. So this is my key conclusions from this session, and I want to thank also the participants. I don't know if we still have time for a few questions.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm not aware of further questions, but I would also like to share my thank you to you as panelists. It was very interactive and very much focused on the governance, and I think the magic recipe which Miriam shared here that was then also complemented by the others was indeed there need to be a political will in place, and then funding can be organized either privately or with public bodies. You should analyze within the different sectors your possibilities, your needs, together then on a multi-level governments and multi-stakeholder approach should gather the different perspectives in order to then plan, implement, and as Lorenzo said, also monitor in order to evaluate against targets how to proceed towards the future. So also from my side, thank you very much for the great panel discussion, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time again. Thank you.